Things are changing. This crazy web dev world can't stop improving for long enough to even nail down a stack. If you're not already familiar, I made the T3 stack at the end of 2021 as an effort to try and categorize the way that I was building. I felt like it had been a while since the mean stack, the MERN stack, the LAMP stack, and all the things I grew up on. As silly as these names and abbreviations may have been, they represented more than just the tech that the names were. For me, they represented moments in time, like a specific event and trend that was happening. The mean stack was the start of a full stack JavaScript world. To me, mean is just as important as node in what it enabled for the future. Yes, we don't use the Mongo Express Angular node stack directly anymore, but those pieces have inspired so much since. When I was in college, I remember the mean stack happening and feeling like there was this exciting movement I could be part of. And I tried, and I hated Angular, I hated Express, I did not like JavaScript much. So I gave up and I went back to my comfort zone in Python land, eventually moving over to Ruby, and then eventually moving over to Elixir. But I noticed this movement, and it was something I wanted to be part of, because these big monumental technologies and stacks, as I was hearing them called, were not common in other places. Sadly, after mean moved to MERN, kind of feels like, well, to be frank, trendy stacks died, and I missed it. I feel like I missed out because I joined web dev well after MERN had burned out. GraphQL was the hot thing, and we saw everybody adopting GraphQL, TypeScript, and then whatever backend language, usually Golang. But I wanted to see a stack happen. At the same time, I had recently left Twitch and was starting to build my own things. I quickly realized, as much as I missed backend and as much as I was loving frontend, that I didn't need to lean on my old backend skills to get what I needed out of these new technologies. And when I started adopting serverless and edge compute more, taking advantage of what Vercel, NextJS, and cool new libraries like tRPC provided, it got much easier to build full stack applications without thinking about all the parts of the stack. It felt like a new generation of tech stack, and I wanted to coin it. I knew others who were starting to use some of the pieces, but I wanted a name for when they were assembled together, and I chose my own name because I'm a conceited asshole, which is how the T3 stack was born. The T is the T in Theo, and the 3 is the other 3 letters. It doesn't stand for Tailwind, TypeScript, tRPC, like everyone seems to think it does. It's just the name I came up with because it's the tech that I used. I made a video called Roundest, where I made an app that lets you pick which Pokemon is most round, because I thought it'd be a fun way to figure out what people's perception of round was, so I could use that for a project I was working on called Round as a code name. I had no idea what I was getting into when I did that. That video is still one of the most viewed videos on my channel. It's incredibly out of date, which is why I filmed an updated one coming out soon, but it really coined this new stack. Since then, I've seen everybody from YouTubers to influencers on Twitter and such to job listings talking about the T3 stack, making tutorials for the T3 stack, and using it as a representation of a shift in full stack software dev. The T3 stack was always kind of made up because all stacks are. I didn't mean for T3 stack to be, you have to use all of these parts. It represented a movement away from 2 separate monoliths, a big front end and a big back end, into something that's both more modular in terms of how it's assembled, but also more cohesive in terms of how the parts come together. All in one full stack TypeScript based solution. I'm so proud of what the T3 stack has enabled and how far Create T3 app has pushed developer experience both inside and outside of the Next.js ecosystem. It's such a cool way to build, but I do think it's starting to get outdated already. I don't mean you shouldn't use it. I certainly don't mean these technologies are going to be thrown away or anything, but due to the modular nature of the T3 stack, I can't help but look at some pieces and notice that there are now better options that are more aligned with what we're trying to do and build. And to keep with the original goal of the T3 stack being the best way to build a modular, full stack, type-safe application, it only seems natural to start looking at these better options and decide when it's time to make changes to the Create T3 app. Someone just mentioned in chat, I'm honestly surprised this phrase hasn't been coined and used a bit more. I'm really proud of it. Bleed responsibly. I love bleeding edge stuff. I love trying new technologies and playing with new things. It's important to recognize the difference between something new that is safe and ready to be adopted versus something that could bring your whole business down. While I might be really interested in a new way to fetch data on client, I'm going to be much less interested in a new way to store data on a database, because the data that my application thrives on is essential to my business's success. I don't want to risk what I'm building on the database being changed, but I'm very, very down to play with new ways to fetch data and render it on client, because that's not going to put my application in anywhere near as big of a risk, and I can always swap things out in the future. So what are the most fragile parts of the T3 stack right now, and what are the things we're looking to adopt in the future? Let's dive in. And again, the T3 stack doesn't mean you use all these pieces. It means that you're working with the mindset of adopting the pieces that make the most sense. I would say the core things that, like, if you're not using them, I would hesitate to call it T3 stack are TypeScript, tRPC, and NextJS. If you're not using these things, it will be a little harder for me to call it T3 stack, but I get it. Beneath this, there are like another tier of things that are pretty common. Like almost everything I see uses them. Prisma's the big one. Tailwind, obviously. And I guess AuthJS fits in here. It's being used less and less. And the amount I've seen the community love the alternatives we're playing with is huge, which is so cool to see. But these are like the core T3 stack pieces. There's also the infra. And I am personally much less hesitant to say something is or isn't T3 stack based on the infra. But usually what we see people deploying on is Vercel for your edge and Lambda functions, PlanetScale or Supabase for your database. I personally lean PlanetScale. I think the features Supabase is building don't benefit the stack as much, but the features PlanetScale is building make our lives significantly easier. So actually, I'm going to not put Supabase here because I don't think it's as relevant there. Vercel, PlanetScale, Upstash, I would say is pretty essential at this point because Upstash, for all the things that the Next.js on Vercel doesn't do, Upstash covers. So like making a Redis-based cache, serverless Kafka, super powerful, and obviously all the cron stuff. Yes, Vercel now has crons, but you can't do them programmatically. You can only do them via like hard-coded values. So if you want a cron to be created when a user does something, you still got to use something like Upstash. And thankfully, they make it very, very nice to do. I would say like this is the core stuff. There's also other pieces in here like Axioms, dope for logging and all things analytics. At this point, it's like we have to put Clerk in. I should also specify all 5 of these companies pay me now. None of them paid me before I used their stuff. And all of them have impressed me well before. I could move on to almost anything else, but honestly, I would use these whether or not they were paying me. And I could have made more money picking alternatives and didn't because these are the things I want to deploy on. So let's go into these pieces and start breaking things down. What's going on and what's changing? So with TypeScript, not much here. I will say in TypeScript land, I'm running into some more problems DX-wise, specifically the hell I've been running into around, how do I put this? My editor performance is getting bad. My TypeScript server dies all the time. In the tutorial I just did for Create T3 app, it died like 3 times in my 3.5-hour recording session. It's bad now. It's not in the best state. I am hopeful we're going to start seeing performance wins. I know there's a big TypeScript update coming soon that's going to help a lot here. But yeah, TypeScript's VS Code server has been having some issues. I'll admit tRPC is some amount guilty here because it does so much inference, and combined with Zod in the depth of the inference, it can get bad. TS5 won't fix it, but the new module stuff that they've done will make it a good bit better. What I would like to see is more intelligent automatic creation of project references, or ideally for Turbo Repo to make it easier to project reference between package boundaries. So I'm more able to lock off my tRPC thing and say, hey, this is the state of this. Still have command click go to working, but like segmenting the heavier things. I see a lot of people saying TS reset. It looks really cool and something I want to play with. I also am thinking about TS ESLint. I've been using TS ESLint on projects more now, and I love a lot of the rules. Some of them, now that I have them, feel like they should have been there all along. And it's just stuff like making sure you always void out a promise if you're not awaiting it. We've found bugs. We knew where there were weird behaviors around because of the things that the TS ESLint recommended rules found in our code base for us. But now there's a whole separate server that's even more fragile that's crashing all the time in my editor. And sometimes I'll reset the TypeScript server and still have an error and realize the error isn't from TypeScript, it's from ESLint. And then I'll reset ESLint as well. And then finally, it will actually show me what I'm looking at. It is slow. It is rough. And God, I wish we could have the rules that TS ESLint gives me the feedback of without just wrecking my editor performance and crashing the server all the time. We're likely going to rip it out of our monorepo for webhook thing because of how bad it's made the editor experience, especially for my CTO when he's using his Intel MacBook, because I can't convince him to upgrade to an M1. So yeah, that's my thinking here. TS reset seems cool. My hesitation is it is so different from how a lot of TypeScript packages behave that I'm expecting conflicts between its expectations and the things that I'm installing. And I'm not sure how I feel about such a hard fork from the default behaviors of TypeScript. It's a really good idea. And I like that we're challenging what TypeScript recommends. It almost feels similar to what we're doing with Create T3 app in terms of how it relates to Create Next app, in that we're proving value in a handful of things. And now they are kind of brute forced to make changes and improve Create Next App as a result of Create T3 App. So I'm hopeful TS Reset, at the very least, is a forcing function to help TypeScript continue to improve. We're not going to be moving off of TypeScript anytime soon. It is still by far the best solution for all of this, but I am excited for a future where TypeScript's experience, specifically around the editor performance and the crashing, smooths out enough for the strictest rule set that make TypeScript the least likely to have problems can also be aligned with the best developer experience of TypeScript. That's where that's at. tRPC. V10 is incredible. If you're not already familiar, tRPC V10 was a massive level up. tRPC V10 is incredible. I have been so impressed with the experience. I know I've shown it off like 1,000 times, but being able to command click from your client to your server while still having proper client-server separation is magical. And the fact that this is portable and can work with other things is so cool. I am really happy with tRPC V10. However, the important thing, React server components shake things up. We'll go more into that in a bit, but the role of tRPC in a React server component supported code base is very different. And we're gonna have to think about that a lot. I'm gonna do a whole tangent about React server components in a bit, so stay tuned for that. What about next? Best way to combine React and your backend. I still firmly believe this. If you wanna do React the React way and have a backend, regardless of how you use Next.js, it's one of the best ways to do that as an all-in-one solution. The power of the app directory inside of Pages is incredible. And the new route paradigm in the app directory is similarly powerful. I think that Next still makes a lot of sense as the core of Create T3 app, but there's going to be a lot of competition nowadays. And there's never been a better time to consider other options. Things like Bling enabling all frameworks to have some of those benefits of not just having backend code deployed in your front end, but actually good co-location. Also, like Remix continues to improve. Solid Start is dope. And even if we stick with Next, App Router is a lot to chew on. So even from the core here, we have a lot to think about and talk about, where like Next.js is changing a lot. Everything around it is changing a lot. Server components change the role of tRPC entirely, and TypeScript's been getting more problematic for me on my machine. I'm not going to leave any of these things behind anytime soon, but there is room to improve in all of them. Let's gun through the rest super quick, and then I'll go on a long rant about server components. So Prisma, the best full stack DX for type-safe DB management. I still firmly believe this. There's no better way to have a file that represents what your database should look like and how you query it in your type definitions. It's been a really good experience to work with as a developer. However, deploying it sucks because the size of the binary it ships is massive. It has to form a SQL connection in order to actually do querying. It has this giant GraphQL binding between the native query layer and the TypeScript layer that actually we use and connect through. It takes a 400 millisecond cold start time and can bump it as high as 3 seconds for basic queries. It's rough. And it's also almost certainly never going to run well on the edge because it doesn't have a connection method that makes sense on the edge. It has this giant Rust binding that you have to connect through. It's pretty rough. On top of that, its performance in mono repos is rough. Getting it set up right there sucked for us, especially if you're also using PNPM. I think they've fixed some amount of the bugs, but nowhere near enough of them. We're not where we want to be here. And thankfully, things are improving. I saw somebody mention there's now the JSON feature flag. I haven't looked into it to kill internal GraphQL bindings. It seems promising. I think it lets you run on the edge, but I'm not sure about that. It still has to make a connection somehow, and I don't want to do it through the Prisma cloud proxy because it's put in weird regions and isn't the best performance that I've seen. It's actually pretty bad performance from what I've seen. And honestly, the spiciest thing here is Planet Scale's DatabaseJS is undefeated. DatabaseJS is very minimal in what it is. It is just a method to connect to and fetch from PlanetScale via a SQL string. So you actually have to write SQL to use DatabaseJS, but it lets you fetch it from anywhere because you're fetching it through HTTP instead of through a direct database connection, which means you can do this from the edge. They're also very close to having HTTP 3 support, which means you can do batched queries and get back batched responses with insanely fast performance. It's stupid fast. I am really hyped on what DatabaseJS enables. However, it doesn't have all the DX that Prisma includes. So how do we get our type safety? How do we get our good code gen. And I already see the name coming up. Y'all have been asking a bunch. It's not Keasley, although I want to put this here because Keasley's really important and pretty close. Keasley's a type-safe query builder. It doesn't know the types of your database and doesn't have a way to define a schema and update your database, but it does have a really cool syntax for querying against your database once the type definitions are made. It also has different drivers, they call them, for connecting different database types. And somebody from our community, Jacob Gillespie, actually created a DatabaseJS driver for Keasley, which is super cool because it means you can use Keasley on the edge to write type-safe queries against your database. Super powerful. I've used it for a bunch of stuff, but there's something cool that we've been seeing more and more of, and they just added the feature that was keeping me from looking into it, Drizzle ORM. Drizzle is looking incredibly promising. Drizzle's an ORM that looks a lot closer to what Prisma does, but it's all in TypeScript. If you know SQL, you know Drizzle. The syntax feels a lot more like SQL when you're actually writing it, but the way you define things like the PG table and all this all exists in TypeScript. So you have a TypeScript file where you define your model, and then you can use their Drizzle migrations helper to actually generate migrations based on the output of this to synchronize your database and get that in the right state. And then you can actually query like awaitdb.select ID name city from users left join cities equal user city ID cities.id. So you have to import a lot of these helpers, which might not be the best thing, but it's so much better than having to deal with all of the baggage and code gen and everything else. The result type here, though, is correct, even with this crazy join going on, which is so dope to see. I have been very impressed with what this enables and the quality of the type definitions that you get in and out when you work with it. It also has a binding for DatabaseJS. And the new feature that I was waiting for, database push. For those who don't know, I don't love migrations. I'll pin a video here and put in the description for those who haven't seen my video about why I don't like database migrations. Generally speaking, a migration, especially if you do migraty things like renames and removes and moves, tend to not be backwards compatible. On top of that, you need to be very careful about when deploys happen and the relationship between the deployed changes and your actual runtime environment and just keep everything in sync sucks. Ideally, a migration should only be able to add or remove, and ideally, the history of when those adds and removes happen should exist entirely within my code base because I have the diff on the file. I don't need to save the history of things changing in two places when I already have it in my commit history. It was something like PlanetScale in their deploy request system. It's much easier to just destroy the database and replace it with the state that you're looking for, and then merge the schema changes to your deployed environment. As such, I don't like generating migrations and running them. It's a bad experience for the stuff that we're doing. Because of that, I use DB push a lot in Prisma and was not interested in using Drizzle until I could have a DB push feature. And I was really impressed with how quickly they shipped Drizzle Kit push. Right now, it's only for MySQL, which makes sense because it's mostly being used by PlanetScale customers. Feature's still in testing process together with adding more CLI warnings and suggestions. Drizzle Kit push is available to use now, though. Really pumped that this is available. I know somebody in YouTube chat asked if Drizzle supports Mongo. Absolutely fuck not. It's for SQL. It's a SQL database dialect. It shouldn't support other things. It should support SQL because it's for SQL. I'm still a little upset that Prisma supports all of the things it does because it doesn't need to support most of them. It is enabling bad decisions when you support things that shouldn't be supported. So I'm hyped on Drizzle. I plan on playing with it much more. I can see it as possibly being the thing that kills Prisma. Been waiting for a long time. Fingers crossed we can finally start using it. Cool. Tailwind. Probably not going anywhere. Tailwind is pretty dope. If you didn't already know, Tailwind I was incredibly skeptical of before I used it and became a very strong fanboy after I started using it heavily. It's been an incredible experience. I see people asking about random like vaporware databases that aren't real standards. I don't care. Like I'm not into like post SQL solutions. SQL's fine. I just want good DX on top of SQL. Remember, bleed responsibly? I'm not going to bleed responsibly on a weird startup that's data standards aren't compliant with the rest of the world. Just it makes no sense. If I can't reliably like PG dump or MySQL dump and throw it somewhere else, I don't trust you. Cool. So Tailwind, probably not going anywhere. I did want to highlight one cool thing. I brought it up earlier. Shad has been working on some very cool stuff with his UI package. The cool thing about Shad's UI stuff is that it's not your traditional NPM install. It's a bunch of example components using Tailwind and Radix UI. And I could see us using some of these examples inside of our code base and actually recommending them as default paths inside of Create T3 app. Been very impressed with what's going on here. This is an example with this fancy modal with all of the handled, like with all the accessibility stuff handled correctly through Radix. But you don't install the package. You go and copy paste the code into your code base, which I love. I don't want to install a package that has a button that works a specific way. I want to have examples of ways things can work and source code that I can update and make changes to. It doesn't animate out. I don't necessarily care if it animates out or not. I think it's nice having it go away immediately, personally, honestly. But yeah, since this is just the code, you can make it animate out yourself. You have the source to do whatever you want to. He's not giving us a component. He's giving us source code so that we can make whatever component we want to make. Very, very helpful. I've been super impressed. Yeah. Here's the code that you actually have to copy paste into your project to use it. Why is this better than Tailwind UI or Headless UI? So Tailwind UI is paid. This is free. Still love Tailwind UI and recommend it heavily if you have the money to spare and you want to support the core Tailwind team. But this is a very good free alternative to Tailwind UI. I will also say that Radix UI is in a much better state than Headless UI in terms of the the headless component library. Radix was just first and has been battle tested by many for half a decade now. And this is the Radix-based alternative to Tailwind UI. I love this. I've been asked about Flowbyte like 100 times now, and I have no idea what it is. So I just want to know what it is so I can shit on it. Components on top of Tailwind. Oh no, this is the same thing. Never mind. My concern here is that this seems to just give you HTML, but I need much more than HTML. I need JavaScript on a lot of these. Will it give React examples for any of these? Nope, it's just HTML. Are all of them just HTML? Because it's still like a good starting point. Flowbyte React bindings in the works. Cool. Well, when that's a thing, that'll be cool to see. I'm a little more sketched out about like how they're going to make money and such, like pro version. Like I don't know who these guys are. I don't want to pay them when I could pay the Tailwind team directly. And Shad's package is open source. And I don't know if it's publicly announced where he's working now. So I can't say just yet until somebody's confirmed that for me. But I know where he's making his money and it's a much safer place. And I'm confident this will stay open source. And it makes a lot of sense. So I like Shad, CN's UI stuff. Is dope. I'm not interested in Uno CSS and a lot of the other like Tailwind syntax things. None of them solve problems that I have. Like Tailwind's compiler is really good and gives me good results both in dev and in production. I have no reason to use something else, especially if I can't get the cool superpowers like the auto sort, which is insanely powerful. Yeah, Tailwind's in a really good spot. I don't see us changing this ever. AuthJS. Here is the final of the core pieces. So what's going on with AuthJS? Previously, Next Auth. Still, by far, the best self-hosted option, but self-hosting kind of sucks. And this is the harsh reality here. Self-hosting Auth sucks. It's awesome that it's as easy as it is with AuthJS, and if you want to have a fully modular stack where you own every piece, AuthJS is still the best solution for that. I've personally started getting tired of it because I have things that AuthJS doesn't make easy. Like, I want preview environments to work with OAuth, so I can sign in with OAuth and have like a good preview experience when I sign in on a PR build. I also want mobile. NextAuth and AuthJS have no real mobile support right now, so you'll be rolling your own effectively from scratch, and I haven't seen a good implementation of that still. Clerk has most of that handled and then some. Clerk also has all of the providers pre-baked with keys, so you don't have to make a new sign-in key and a new callback URL for every single service you want to test in. You can use their keys during dev and then switch them to your keys when you're ready to ship in production. Clerk's been a much better experience for me, so I've been recommending Clerk. Clerk isn't in Create T3 app for a couple of reasons. The first one is I really want to keep the core of Create T3 app, all open source, self-hostable technologies, to stay within the spirit of the modular approach. And also, they pay us. And I'm careful about crossing the line where the people who are sponsoring the channel get positions high up in our recommendations. So being careful about how we go about this, but I definitely see a future where Clerk is much easier to like run a command and have be part of Create T3 app, or a plugin system that makes it easier to adopt Clerk when you already have Create T3 app set up. That said, I have a video coming out soon where I use Create T3 app and Clerk, and it was like 4 lines of code to add it. It wasn't a big deal at all, but I would love a future where Clerk's integration is as simple as NextAuth's integration, in that you click a button or enter a command and it is added correctly to your code base. So we are investigating this further. I think that's it for these things. Monorepos. How do I want to put this? Turbo is a massive win. And it really is. Like Turbo Repo, and Turbo Pack both are going to be essential in keeping the developer experience of these tools good, especially as your applications scale and you have bigger teams, bigger like chains of dependencies. You have applications that have backends being consumed by like 15 things. There's a lot of potential wins coming from the Turbo ecosystem. Turbo's a massive win. NX is dope too. The main benefit of Turbo's ecosystems, both Turbo Repo and Turbo Pack, is the granularity of the caching. Turbo doesn't redo work you don't need to redo. So if a package wasn't touched and its dependencies weren't touched, it doesn't need to recheck the types and recompile the output. It can use the cached one. If you're in a code base like a Next.js code base that's using Turbo Pack, it will only have to recompile the files that have been changed rather than all of the files whenever a change is made. These powers are what make Turbo Pack and Turbo Repo so useful as your code bases scale, because you'll never actually have to work at the scale of the code base unless something that everything depends on is changed. Ideally, that will almost never happen, and the result is your updates are only dependent on the things that have been changed. Very excited for where these things are going. I would love a future where we adopt Turbo as like a main recommended path in Create T3 app, but my concern is that it's not an abstraction everyone needs, and it does visually make things a little more complex when you're first starting with Create T3 app. And I don't want to fill your code base with a bunch of things that you might not understand when you're trying to just do a better Create Next app init. I could see a future where we offer a monorepo option when you're getting started with Create T3 app, but it's not necessarily the main direction we want to recommend as the default. We also have Create T3 Turbo already, which is a fantastic repo that was originally created by Julius. There's quite a few contributors to it now. Not as much as Create T3 app, but the goal of Create T3 Turbo is very specifically to show you how you can do a Turbo repo with Create T3 app with a separate mobile app and web app that share backend code. Obviously, this doesn't have Next Auth or AuthJS in it, because if it did, it wouldn't work on mobile, but there is actually a fork that is run by Clerk. Create T3 Turbo Clerk is a fork that is maintained by James, who I saw is in chat here. I'll link this in chat for people who don't already have it, which is super powerful because it's Create T3 Turbo with the addition of Clerk for auth. So you set up an account on Clerk, you go swap out the environment variables, and now you can deploy your mobile app and your web app with the same backend and same auth system. I already have a video about this as well, as does James. So there's a bunch of context on how to use the stack. It's in a really cool place. I love it. I'm not sure what the role of this is yet in the whole Create T3 app ecosystem, but it is a thing I'm thinking a lot about. So that's pretty much everything out on the table in terms of what we've been looking at and thinking about. We're not leaving Next.js anytime soon. We're probably not going to make most of these changes defaults. But the big thing that I've been dancing around, because it's scary to talk about, the RSC question. What do we do about server components? So this has been tough for me. I was very skeptical of server components, and to some degree, I still am. Server components, for those who aren't familiar, are a method in React of running your component on the server. In a traditional React application, you have your React bundle of JavaScript code that gets sent down to the client, usually with an empty HTML page, and then the client downloads that JavaScript, runs it, figures out what needs to actually be on the page, and then generates that page on the client for the user. It might additionally fetch data and do other things, but generally you get an empty HTML page and then React on the client will render the page. This is called a single page app. It's been the standard since React started getting popular. It's how something like Twitch still runs to this day. This isn't ideal though, which is why Next was first made. The original goal of Next.js was to make it so you can take that HTML that React generates and generate it initially on the server, so you always get back a complete HTML page, and then the client can catch up and hydrate the page from there. This came with a bunch of problems though. Specifically, your React code runs in two places. It runs once on the server with all of the expected server constraints, and then after the fact, it runs again on the client, but now it doesn't have access to some of the things it might have on the server. So if you were awaiting some data from your database, or you were like connecting to something you can't connect to on client, or the opposite, on client, you're using AV devices from the user's like computer or browser, and those don't exist on the server. Your code having to run in both places meant you had to be considerate of both the server runtime and the client runtime for all of your React code. And that isn't a great experience. It also meant we weren't getting a lot of the benefits of the server because you couldn't really run server code in components because those components had to run on the client as well. So you couldn't make a DP call on a component. You'd have to make an endpoint or a get server-side props function that does the backend part, and then the client gets that data through any of many different methods. React server components throw all of that away. We're starting from scratch again. We have to rethink our model because components don't run on client by default anymore. In modern Next.js using app router and React server components, you can await a database call and return some JSX, and that code will never run on the client. This is clearly a huge mental shift for a lot of people, more so than I thought. The reason I say that is when I go to the comment section of my most recent video about server components. Yeah, it's going to be around here. SQL injection enthusiasts love this. Creating connection to the DB from the front end is not safe for obvious reasons. Client security. You can't just let clients make arbitrary SQL queries. Why are you gay? As you guys can see, React server components are really hard for a lot of people to understand. And I think it's really simple. And I'll be honest, it confused me more than it probably should have for a little bit too. React server components don't run in two places. And that's what we're used to. With React components, they either only run on the client or they run on the client and run once on the server. With React server components, they only run on the server, which means we have to throw away some of the baggage we have in our brains of a component is a thing that the client runs, because it isn't always. That also means a lot of the tools we use to get data to components aren't as useful as they used to be. The big elephant in the room is tRPC. And the question that I don't have a good answer to yet is, what happens to tRPC post server components? This is a tough question, and I've been thinking a lot about it. You can use tRPC with server components. There's a lot of cool ways you can do it. I've actually played with some of them. Server-side calls. Here. You can make a caller in tRPC. This is telling you not to do it to call procedures within other procedures, which makes sense. But here you can create a caller for your router that allows you to make calls to tRPC without having to go over HTTP, which means if you already have a tRPC router in your code base and all you want is to call those same functions in server components without having to go over an HTTP boundary, you can use the caller. And this is effectively the same as just directly calling the function because it's running on the same machine. It's just another way to call your tRPC stuff without having the additional latency of a server in between. And this is very, very powerful. There's also a pattern that I've been playing with more and more outside of server components, the SSG helper that they have in Next, or for Next in tRPC, which lets you ahead of time fetch specific things using the proxy SSG helper. So here, we're awaiting ssg.post.byId prefetch. We're prefetching this post using the ID we get from the static prop definition. We pass in dehydrated SSG helper as props. And now on the client, there isn't the loading state for this query because this query is prehydrated and already exists. But we still have all of the invalidation patterns that exist inside of React query. So if we want to update this post because you click the like button, we want to update it, we can hit that same query client cache and have the ability to update all of that data. There is going to be some combination of all of these pieces that allows for the tRPC DX we know and love to be aligned with and combined with the new caching systems that are being introduced in React server components and Next to allow us to have a good experience writing and calling functions in our client components, our server components, and our applications that aren't necessarily either, be it a different, like a TV app, for example, where we can't use React server components, or a mobile app where React Native for server components isn't quite there just yet. The power of what this enables is super cool, but honestly, you don't need this for the data fetching too often. Having a better, reliable cache layer could be cool, but I think that's going to come from Next anyways. What I'm more scared of is how are we going to deal with mutations? There is still no mutation RFC from the React server components and Next.js team. I'll be honest, I've seen a little bit and it looks good, but it doesn't give us the wins that I'm used to from tRPC. Specifically, the validation of inputs when the server or when a user fires a query, being able to validate the data in the shape of it before I even start running my function. When you use primitives like form data in traditional get and post requests with bodies, you don't have a validation layer guaranteed. you're writing your own validation layer for everything, which means that you're blind on both sides. When I post to an endpoint or run a mutation that's expecting form data, I don't know the type that expects because I'm just throwing at a pile of data. I don't have a validation layer to infer the type either from. So I don't have anything beyond what I roll myself for every single function to guarantee that the shape of things is what I expect on both sides. And it feels like we're going to have a GraphQL type problem again, where people start defining schemas in between their server functions and their client to make sure the relationship between this all is correct. And the spicy take, I don't know why this isn't said enough. And it honestly, it kind of hit me like a truck when I thought of it. Mutations are a client-side problem. Server components don't run on client. They're not a client-side problem. Server components actually take something that we've kind of unintentionally forced to be a client-side problem and get it out of the client, which is dope. But mutations are still very much a client-side problem. And as such, the React server component patterns don't help us here at all. In fact, they make it a bit harder because we currently rely on React context as the API to wrap our application and trigger updates when mutations happen to keep things in sync. You can't do a global React context provider anymore because context breaks over server component boundaries. If we wrap our app in a context, it's going to die as soon as it hits a server component, which is going to be probably immediately because you're wrapping the top of your app with it. We can't use the patterns we're used to, and that sucks. There will be new patterns. I've already seen what some of them look like. Use SWR is using some of them, and I'm building things on top of it right now to make it work. But the current React query pattern of context-heavy updates is unrealistic in server components. We're going to have to break those off into another thing. Totally doable, totally fine. I see people saying you can wrap individual components in context and it will be shared. No, it won't. It'll be shared from that component down, but it won't be shared across all of them. If you have an external store that they're all synchronizing through, it can if you set up your subscriptions and updates correctly, but that's a lot of work to do, and that's not realistic. No, it's not a realistic path. I see people saying, what about getting data from server side, hydrating it into React Query, and then using mutations? That's what we do right now with tRPC and Create T3 app, especially if you use the static site generation helper I showed earlier. It's good, but it's not the same good experience that we have with server components. Obviously, we're going to see endless PHP jokes. That's never going to stop. But the thing PHP doesn't have is a cache layer. If I query some data in PHP, I can't really update it without refreshing the whole page. All of these new solutions have really good ways to update their data and handle caching on the client. It's so cool what server components enable and how much simpler they make developer experience for so many things. I'm sold. Server components are the future, and it is a much better way to do a lot of things in your React applications. I'm nowhere near as sold on mutations yet, which means there's some room here. This is set and done. If I was to, the one way I could characterize this is the space as it exists right now, there's a spectrum of, I'll say, data fetching and data updating. On the left side here, we have like a text file in your code base, JSON, config, file, and code base. Something a little further along would be like some value from DB. When we get crazy into updating land, like the furthest along here would be like WebSocket streaming new data, just constantly getting updates and changing the contents of the page when it gets those updates. We can have something a little more reasonable, like liking a post and triggering DB update. It's a rough spectrum, and I'm sure people are going to debate this endlessly, but like this is one way of thinking about queries versus mutations. I would argue that they're all a spectrum, and it's a spectrum of how often do these things change and how much do I want to think about those changes on the client. What I might want to do now is draw this line, like where do the tools help us? So if I go back to the OG get server-side props. Get server-side props helps us, I'd say right about to here. When we're getting values from DB, it can help us with that. But if we want to update those values when something else happens in our app, it doesn't actually help with any of that at all. Here is where GSSP helps. And then here is where tRPC helps. tRPC and React Query help a ton in this space here. Everything after the first paint when we want to start like updating things on the client. Like tRPC and React Query take over from there. And generally, what I've recommended is doing as little of this as possible in favor of leaning into tRPC and React Query. So your update layer, your mutations, and all of those types of things will be easier to deal with. Although I will say, there's a point further along here where once you're updating things constantly, like you can use tRPC and the use subscription stuff, but it doesn't have a great back and forth pattern. And once you start posting through the socket as well, there are better solutions. None that I'm confident enough to name, but like in here, I would expect some type of WebSocket solution. We're going to ignore that going forward because you can do it with tRPC, but I just wanted to point out that there's a level at which your updates are happening fast enough that you want to rethink these things. So where stuff gets interesting with App Router is these lines are now defined pretty differently. This goes a lot further along, although right now it stops basically right before this triggered update happens. However, there's a point here I probably should have mentioned before of post updating when a like occurs on client. For me, there's a line between the thing on client updating or in the thing the user triggered running on the server. And these are different things. There's a relationship between them. This one is much more heavy on client and updating. This one's much heavier on data fetching because this depends on how the data fetching occurred. I see confusion about App Router, NextJS 13 App Router. App Router is the official term for the app directory. When people keep saying Next 13, what they're referring to is the App Router. When they say can Create T3 apps support Next 13, we already support Next 13. We have since day one. The App Router is the new beta feature. This is the name for it. That's what we're calling it. App Router is the thing in Next 13. So the new cache primitive in Next and React makes updating this when a change occurs much easier because you can invalidate the cache on a specific key. They don't actually have an example in here, but one of the things I know exists, I've seen it in source code public, is an actual like cache helper function that you wrap things with. It doesn't show it in here, but when you fetch, you can fetch with a tag or a set of tags. At any point, you can revalidate a tag to update it. And that cache layer, the ability to trigger granular updates on client, is a very important part of the workflow here. And I do think Next 13 supports this well enough. From what I've seen and what they're working on, I think the actual cache updating on client side is something that Next handles well. And this significantly moves this line. With Next 13, everything in this section becomes more accessible, more type safe, easier to work with, and just a general better experience. But it also kind of widens the gap between the two. It almost feels like there's a no man's land between these areas now, where bridging the gap between this client thing that's triggered and the server cache sucks. I don't know how this is going to be bridged. I've seen proposals, I've played with things, but right now, this gap feels more present than ever. I can show an example, actually. That's a good call. I have a project I was working on, obviously the tutorial project with a Mojer, but I also rebuilt it inside of the new server component patterns. And what we'll see here in my compose function. So this file is a client file. This is for a Twitter clone. This is the file that actually lets you post a new tweet. And I had to do a lot more in here than I would have liked. The first thing is I can't use React Query because of the lack of context. I could, but I didn't want to roll like React Query in a client component and wrap all of that and deal with all that. So I did use SWR for this. I had to make a create post function. This is a client function I had to define myself just to do the posting locally. So it takes in a URL, which is a string. This is the string for what to post to. And then the arg, which is the actual message that I'm trying to post. I then await fetching from that URL, this JSON blobbed up guy. And then in the actual component, I kind of had to roll my own optimistic update layer where I have the SWR mutation with the API post endpoint create post. Trigger is mutating in data. Trigger is how you trigger the change. Is mutating is the loading state for when a mutation is occurring, and data is the result if we get back a result. I also have use transition here, which is a new hook React 18 introduces to tell React, hey, things are changing. Don't update the DOM just yet though. Wait till these things are done. So I wrap the actual changes here in a start transition. I do the await for the trigger first so that I can have a different loading state before and after. But since I have no way yet of granularly updating or optimistically updating my feed to just show that new post, I actually have to wait for the post to be made and then do a full router refresh that will then go to the server and say, hey, I'm assuming all my data is old. Give me new data, please, right now. The server then generates the new data, sends the new JSX, new info, new everything that React needs to update to the client, which then triggers a client-side update. And after that, I set the content, which is like your input field, to empty string, so it's finally empty after the loading state. What this looks like, if I go to the deployed page, is I post an emoji. You don't see much happen there because that's the loading state. And then it does the router refetch. It still shows that there. It was in a disabled state. I'm not showing that visually. I probably should lower the opacity or something. It then goes and does all of the work to post, update the data on client, and then finally empties this input field and shows me the changes that I made. Ideally, it'd be way easier to do optimistic updates on the client, and the patterns I've seen for this haven't been super elegant yet. React Query wasn't the best, but I had a good experience for this before. Not great, but good enough. I think we need to entirely reimagine these patterns now for the experience to continue improving, with this gap getting even wider now. This component has no idea about anything that's fetched prior. It has no concept of what data exists on the page and can be updated in the first place. So from here, I can't really do anything. And even the pattern for writing this mutation is sketchy because there's no type safety between things. So like if I go to app, API, post, route, I have a post schema, which is a Zod validator, and I run the Zod validator. But look at all of the stuff I have to do before I'm actually confident I can use the data that you passed here. It's obnoxious. And when we're seeing these new patterns on server components that are so much better than anything else, like if I just go to the tweets homepage view here, this is just a component, which means it's by default a server component. And in here, I const rows equals await db.execute, and I have the data. I could use Prisma here. I can use anything here, and I have the data. If I want this to be cached, I can wrap it in the cache primitive, and now, once that's officially out and shipped, it's cached. It is that simple for data fetching. This level of simplicity and elegance is not matched in updating data and mutating data yet. The DX for this is so good, we have to use it. It's so much better. It almost feels irresponsible to not. However, this is the big however, it does widen the gap both in DX and relationships between updates on client and data fetched from server. And that's not something that's been bridged yet. And that scares me. And I don't want to prescribe Next 13 app router and move us away from tRPC until it feels like we have a really good solution for this ever widening gap. And I think we're getting there. What I've been referring to this gap as, and I've been talking with Dan Abramov a bunch about this, is the interaction boundary. It's the point at which your application becomes interactive and data changes due to actions users take. Historically, React has exclusively been an interactive framework. And now it's the opposite, where by default, nothing is interactive. You have to define interaction boundaries. But now that we're defining those boundaries ourselves, we have to build bridges over it. And I'm a little concerned that we aren't there just yet. And I think a lot of the value of the T3 stack in the future is going to be prescribing better solutions here. While Next App Router will be stable in the near future, I am less confident that these patterns will be established in a confident enough way for us to immediately start adopting them. But I am confident we'll get there. And I'm beginning to think the role of tRPC in the T3 stack here is to prove you can make an incredible bridge over this gap. I want us to build the bridge here. This has been keeping me up at night recently, like straight up. I want to figure out how to make DX that bridges this gap as good as the DX of living on either side of it. And we can get there. I'm confident we can, but we have to really think through the relationship between the data that we fetch on the server and the actions our users take on the client. And it is complex. It's hard. We're going to have a long fight to get there. We're probably going to make mistakes along the way. It took 4 renditions of React server components for there to be one that we really liked. I see a debate going on in chat about, but refetching everything is fine. No. Again, I'll show you the example on the version I've deployed here. Nice emojis. If I post here, I am posting, I'll let you guys see when. Posting now. That's quite a bit of time to see an update. And it was slower before too. It's faster now that things are warmed up, even though it's all edge routed. Yeah, it's scary. I'm not super confident that this is a gap we can bridge quickly, but I am confident it's a thing that we can make better. And good optimistic update patterns in particular, as well as more granular cache and validation, are one of the patterns we've grown to expect and love here that isn't really the case just yet in React server component land. That said, the amount of wins server components offer in terms of how we compartmentalize our code and think about the dependencies of our components, like the fact that a component can have data it depends on and get that data, it's so powerful. I don't want to let these types of reservations keep us from embracing these new patterns. If anything, I want to take these challenges and make them the strengths of what we're building in Create T3 app and in this ecosystem. And I think the future of the T3 stack is showing you how to do this right. Again, could be entirely wrong about this. That's what I've been thinking a lot about. So let's summarize the future of the stack quick. Prisma alternatives are dope. I really want to get more of our compute on the edge, and I think Prisma alternatives are going to make it way more easy to do and significantly improve the performance of applications we're building on T3 stack. Prisma alternatives are dope. I want to ship one ASAP, but we got a bit of time till we're there. Tailwind, Next, React, and TS are here to stay. App directory will be a fun challenge. Self-hosting auth sucks sometimes. Alternative stacks. I expect this to be all the rage throughout the year. I'm already seeing it happen. Create O3 app. Oh, it's O7 app. Nice. Create JD app's been around for a bit. Side base. I'll throw a Bling stack. So those aren't already familiar. Create O7 app by Automated. Otto's the homie. He does a lot of tech for like Ludwig. He did all the tech for the Streamer Reward stuff. Great dude. He loves Rust and he loves SvelteKit, but he also loves tRPC and a lot of the stuff we talk about here. So he's taken a bunch of the Create T3 app concepts and built a Rust-based CLI for SvelteKit apps, which is really cool. Bling will change things. This almost feels like it needs to be a separate video. I'm going to wait. This will be a spoiler for the inevitable video I'm doing on Bling in the future. So I'm just going to rant and not type for a sec. The TLDR on Bling is it's a new syntax that has been worked on by Tanner Lindsley, Ryan Carniato, and a bunch of the Astro and Solid Start team to make it easier to write server functions in your client applications. Bling is heavily Vite-based. The goal of Bling is to make it easier to write server functions in your Vite app so you can write server $, do some stuff, and then call this fetch function on your client with type safety and everything behaves how you would expect. It's a very powerful syntax for a consistent shared server primitive across the entire Vite ecosystem. The only dependency to use this is Vite. So if your stuff can use Vite, you can use Bling. I know that Parasocial Meta Learning's here, and he actually made it work with a jQuery stack based on my dumb joke that you could do it. So there's a Bling jQuery example that's out. So yeah, this will technically work with everything. This is the pattern that was originally introduced in Solid Start. I'm sure that they were inspired by a bunch of different things, but the goal of the server $sign macro was to give you a simple syntax that a compiler could hook into and generate the right backend files, while also giving you, as the developer, consistent developer experience and type safety as we co-locate our code. You kind of think of this as like remix loaders for everyone with much better syntax and consistent ways of using the data. And it works great in everything from Astro to DIY Vite deployments with a server. It's a really powerful way to access data on your applications. What this reminds me of is the Vite moment. When Vite first happened, we saw a renaissance in JavaScript frameworks. Most of the things we talk about now were in development before Vite, but few of them made as much sense to adopt as they did post-Vite. Vite enabled us to build things like Astro, like Solid and Solid Start, like all the stuff that the Quick team is doing. Vite's become this really powerful piece that does so much of the heavy lifting that it enabled us to focus on the other important parts of the developer experience and performance and all the other things we need to build as JavaScript framework developers. What I see here with Bling is a similar building block for full stack framework building. What I think Vite did for client-side JavaScript frameworks, Bling does for full-stack JavaScript frameworks. This was one of the hardest things to do before, and it went from nearly impossible to roll yourself to a package you can install. Once this is in a nice, stable state, and we know more and more about what can be done with it, I see a future where most things start with Bling. And I'm not thinking we're going to have a bunch of massive new full-stack frameworks that use Bling to take over React and Next. I see an opportunity for us to try insane stuff using Bling as a way to prototype new ideas and patterns. Very excited about the future of what we can see here. And I do think frameworks will be moving a lot faster once more of them have the ability to play with and use Bling. Again, this isn't my Bling video. This is just me touching on Bling quick. Bling is the future. It's going to enable us to iterate and innovate a lot faster. I think things are going to be changing super quick once Bling happens. So if you'll ask me about the Chad stack, we're talking about real stacks, boys. Sorry, but here we like to talk about software that ships.